Okay, welcome guys. Thank you for being with us. This is our third installment of Politics with Roger. This is our weekly recap. Every Friday we cover the relevant, the important stories, the important media narratives of the week, and we give them a little bit of analysis. We just, just a little short and sweet. Hopefully 10 to 15 minutes. We'll try to cover what's important. We'll get right to it. We ended last week talking about the mainstream media's narrative collapsing, where basically, since Charlottesville, they've been trying to tie Trump supporters into white supremacy, the KKK, hate groups, and you see this falling flat. And also in this narrative, you see the mainstream media trying to make Antifa to be out to be some kind of protector group, or they call themselves the anti-fascists. They tried to basically claim the moral high ground that they're fighting fascism. And towards the end of the last week, you saw that narrative completely falling apart. We'll touch a little bit more on that in a minute. There was action over the weekend in Berkeley where basically Antifa had a march, and a lot of Antifa people were out. And there was also some people sponsoring prayer meetings, prayer groups, and having just basically public prayer demonstrations. And you saw Antifa basically using violence against anybody that they didn't like in Berkeley this weekend. It had a big effect, but we'll touch on that in a second. The other media main story towards the end of last week was the anticipation of Hurricane Harvey touching down in Houston, and that did happen early last week. In the Sunday and Monday, Hurricane Harvey turned out to be a record-setting hurricane, more flooding than ever before. And then you saw early in the week also the media narratives kind of starting to take place. I mean, I don't want to accuse mainstream media of cheering for bad things to happen, but it seemed very quickly they wanted to pin anything bad on the president. This is par for the course. This is how it goes. For all intents and purposes, it would appear that so far, I mean, it is Friday, September 1st, we're hopefully out of the worst of Hurricane Harvey. Compared to Hurricane Katrina, it seems like Hurricane Harvey was very, very well handled. I know they're talking, one big difference was the role of FEMA, and bringing FEMA into a situation like this in Texas, for example. Governor Abbott was very adamant about Texas taking the lead, Texas institutions, National Guard taking the lead in emergency control, emergency response. And FEMA was more of a supporting role, where you saw something different in Hurricane Katrina, where FEMA took the lead away from local government, and that seemed to be where a lot of problems happened. I don't know. I don't want to minimize the damage of Hurricane Harvey, but sitting here Friday, hopefully the worst is over. We can start picking up the pieces, and it's never easy to handle these kind of disasters or rank them, but I think the feeling so far is that Hurricane Harvey was much better handled than Hurricane Katrina. We'll talk about that in weeks to come on why and how. Also happening on Tuesday, a report that North Korea had fired a missile over Japan, and it seemed that North Korea started to, the story over North Korea, hopefully Kim Jong-un would stand down and stop making trouble. But then this story came out. Now, I mean, I don't have any verification. I mean, I'm just purely speculating. But when I saw this story, to me, it didn't kind of sit right, because a couple weeks ago, Kim Jong-un was threatening his missile test over Guam, and then he ended up blinking, standing down. And the reason I'm thinking that I don't know, the reason it doesn't make sense to me that he would be the source of this provocation. I think we can agree that anybody in his situation, anybody who's in charge of a country that's as crazy as North Korea, I mean, obviously they probably not our definition of mentally stable, But even if we can agree that he's not mentally stable, I know he's not, I don't know, but I'm going to assume he's not suicidal. And a provocation with the United States, especially with the president coming out so strong against, or just having very strong rhetoric against North Korea, I think a provocation by Kim Jong-un would be a big mistake. That's why I kind of think, even though they're saying there was a missile launched over Japan, I don't know. My instincts tell me that Kim Jong Un didn't have anything to do with it. Moving on, the media, with the record flooding in Houston and the North Korean missile strike, they chose. I understand. I didn't really touch on a lot of this, but I understand that Melania's shoes, the First Lady's shoes, became a big story this week. We're not going to talk about it a lot, but I just wanted to bring it up. While all these important stories were happening, this is what our media was talking about, our mainstream media. So if you're watching television, you weren't hearing about North Korea. You weren't hearing about any positive stories in the Hurricane Harvey emergency response. All you're hearing is about Melania's shoes. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point. I understand during the middle of the week that was the big rage in the cultural media. And pop culture. Wednesday and towards the middle of the week, we saw the Antifa story really start to pick up because Nancy Pelosi and other major Democrat politicians began denouncing Antifa. And this was hugely significant. And this is really what made this a great week for nationalists and Trump supporters and just people who are really fighting for the truth, because anybody could see that Antifa were not anti-fascists. They were acting as fascists. They were not peaceful. And for our mainstream media to try to convince the masses here in America that Antifa was a force for good while simultaneously committing acts of violence against peaceful protesters, I mean, that was a real Orwellian tactic and communist tactic, and that's why we got to be careful with these guys. The mainstream media, the globalists, these guys are brutal, and they're playing for keeps. But the Antifa narrative fell apart. This was a huge victory for the liberty movement and for the nationalists, because and just for the truth in general, because people just simply were not buying it. I have to give a huge shout out to Arthur Schapper of Los Angeles, who actually was in Berkeley over the weekend and was at a protest, and he's a very activist. A lot of people in Los Angeles know him. He's a great guy. And he went out and endured really just awful persecution and abuse from a lot of Antifa protesters, or people from Antifa basically chased him down in the streets of Berkeley and just subjected Arthur to all sorts of abuse and called him every name in the book and were spitting on him. And what happened was images from that incident ended up going national. You saw images of this all over the news, especially internet media, on Wednesday and Thursday. And it really was a turning point to the Antifa narrative. I mean, it was shortly after that you saw Nancy Pelosi make the statement on Antifa being a terrorist organization. So, I mean, Arthur Schapper, way to go, man. That was awesome. Sorry that you had to go through all that, abuse. But it made a huge difference, and it was a huge win for the Patriots. So, way to go. I mean, big shout out to Arthur. Towards the end of the week, economic news, jobs are up. The growth from the second quarter was revised above 3%. President Trump made a statement that Obama never had over 3% growth. Of course, there's some back and forth on whether or not that's true. I do remember during Obama's 8 years that the economic numbers were often revised after the fact. It's a tactic that is used. I think bottom line is that Donald Trump's economy is coming back. You're seeing evidence of this, even though the Fed now keeps raising interest rates, even though in the last 8 years before Trump they never did. I think they've raised it 2 or 3 times already in Trump's administration. So it's really something else. Trying to speed up and get through this. Glenn Beck and the Blaze is on the way out. He, I think, laid off another 1/3 of his staff. We don't really. don't wish for anyone to fail here, especially someone who claims to be on the right side of politics. Glenn Beck jumped on the Never Trump train early. I think he ended up coalescing and colluding with a lot of the mainstream media. I think he wanted to get involved and get out front and become a part of the establishment pre-2016, pre-Trump. And I think you're seeing basically the consequences of that. I think people turned away from his show, turned away from his media empire in droves, and now he's laying off everybody, and I don't know how much longer the Blaze will be around. But that's going on there. And finally, what's going to happen next week? We've talked about this a little before. Now, the Antifa narrative falling apart, you can expect the mainstream media to really accelerate and pile on with the narrative that the president is unfit to serve mentally, that he has maybe Alzheimer's. You see also increasingly his administration and the team that he brought in isolating him more and more from the establishment. And this is kind of a scary thing too. I don't know how Trump's going to handle it, how he's been maneuvering. I mean, he seems to be one step ahead of everybody, but I don't know, the stakes are high, and it's always very concerning that he's got people all around him that do not support his agenda and are also acting as saboteurs, acting as people that say one thing and then act another way. So we'll see how things proceed in the next week. I don't think Antifa will just necessarily go away right away. We might see some more violence from them, but on the other hand, now that they've lost backing from the Democrat Party, now that some of them are actually going to jail for the violence that they're committing, I don't see Antifa hanging around too long once some of them are prosecuted for the crimes that they commit, rightfully so. But before they had backup from Democrat operatives, Democrat local governments, and they did not have to fear prosecution. But I think they've lost their political cover. So I don't think Antifa will be around for a long time, but we'll see moving forward. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week with the recap and see what happens. All right, adios.